What we have for you tonight is essentially a continuation of the last presentation that we had. And information we'll be presenting to you this evening will be a summary of the scope of work that we were tasked to perform as part of this parking study. Some of the findings from that presentation that we did back in August. One of the things that is new that we did not have at that time is a calculation of the parking demand, looking at what it is today and then making some adjustments for what it may be in the future. One of the other things that we've identified is some opportunities for shared use to use the available parking perhaps more efficiently, and then we have some conclusions and recommendations for you. The scope of work that we were asked to provide was to inventory the existing parking. So as part of our field work, we actually quantified and qualified all the parking within the downtown. We identified its time limit, 1 hour or 2 hour, whatever that was, and classified that as whether it was publicly provided or privately provided. One of the things that, from our standpoint, public parking is parking that is available regardless of your destination. You can park there and visit multiple destinations. Private parking, generally, when you park there, you're visiting a specific destination. When your visit is concluded, you're generally expected to move your vehicle so that that private business owner has that parking available for his next business. We did parking counts where between 6 a.m. and 11 p.m. on 2 days, a Thursday and a Saturday, we actually conducted hourly occupancy counts throughout the downtown. In the on-street spaces, we recorded portions of the license plate number. We could see where those spaces turning over. We conducted an online customer surveys to get information, and these was from employees, downtown business, visitors, commuters, each of the various demand categories. We've calculated tonight the current parking demand. I'll go into that in a moment, looking at also future potential parking demand. What we also have is looking at some best practices or some things that can be adjusted within the village to make the parking work perhaps a little more efficiently. Looking at allocation as to where we are directing folks to, where we are directing folks to go to, for their parking, some opportunities for potential future parking, and then various improvements that might be available. What we found at the survey from what we presented last time was the public supply is stressed. We were reaching about 85% of those spaces were occupied during the peak time. Now 85% is really kind of the magic number for folks. Once you hit 85% occupancy, perceptually you have not enough parking, because even though parking is available, I'm going to have to hunt for it. It may not necessarily be right near my destination. When we break this out for north and south, 58% of the parking on the south is publicly available, and 41% of the parking on the north is publicly available. In some of the conversations that we have, there was a desire for some short-term 10 to 15-minute spaces. You have a number of businesses that would like to have that parking. They have a number of quick in and out, some pizza restaurants, dry cleaners, bakeries, those kinds of things. And one of the other things that we noticed that we presented last time was the signs. There was a little bit confusing in terms of the signs. We have some recommendations for that. Some other findings, the valet spaces, there was some confusion on some of those. Just looking at could we reduce the number of commuters, and what would that mean in terms of providing additional parking for customers or employees. One of the other things that we found is the commuters, even though they're restricted to the lots that are designated commuter parking until 12 o'clock before someone can park in those spaces, our analysis found that the very majority of the commuters are actually in by shortly after 8 o'clock. You've got about 97% of your morning commuters have parked and have taken the train by that point, so we think we can open those spaces up. The library parking, the library, which is the Forest Lot South parking area, that is designated 3-hour parking, and essentially anybody can park there. There's no designated employee parking, or library parking. The analysis that we conducted on our Saturday survey, where we found more vehicles staying longer than 2 hours. The spaces were not turning over quite as well as they were on the Thursday survey day. Seemed to indicate employees know there's no enforcement on Saturdays, so they're taking those nice convenient spaces on the streets. And from the surveys that we conducted, the time limits that you have, the 2-hour, the 3-hour, and even the 4-hour in the parking garage, for most folks the time limits seemed to be appropriate. They didn't seem to have a problem with time limits and being able to complete their business downtown. The limits were okay with them. One of the other things that we found is the surplus capacity that we have is in the privately controlled spaces. Now that's kind of important, because if a business owner, for example, has 10 spaces, he's only using 5 of those spaces. Those extra 5 spaces are not available to someone coming to visit another destination typically. They're very protective of those spaces. I know there are some signs around downtown that, you know, don't even think of parking here. This is restricted for this business. Parking for downtown employees, if they don't have space associated with their business, they may be competing with commuters or forced to park on the street. And our analysis found we actually found about a 6% violation rate, where we found the same 6% of vehicles in the same spot beyond the time limits. One of the things that may be a little bit low is because if a vehicle, you don't have an ordinance now to prevent someone from taking their vehicle and moving it several spaces. When we'd come around again, that would be a new vehicle, because there's no rule against that. And one of the other things that we found was right now there is a restriction. The top level of the parking garage is a commuter designated area. You have some spaces up there, and then the rest of that is daily fee parking. But it's restricted that you can't park up there until I believe it's 8:30 in the morning, 8 o'clock. And our feeling is to not make it the 3rd and 4th level of the garage are daily fee, and those can be taken over starting at 6 o'clock in the morning. One of the things that we felt was we should not change that restriction on the top level of the deck and allow commuters to park up there, because that is actually a good location for a downtown employee who may not necessarily have a permit, or their employer does not want to pay for a permit on the 2nd level because it's only part-time. They may be here 2-3 days a week. If they don't park in those permit spaces, then they can go to the top level of the deck. So we think that should be restricted, and so we don't have all the commuters up there. Now, one of the best practices that we see is a shared use strategy. And what this slide is showing you is typically in a community there'll be a requirement of so many spaces per 1,000 square feet. For example, maybe retail, it might be 3 spaces. For a restaurant or something, it may be 10 spaces. On the non-shared use basis, that does not make a distinction that restaurant needs 10 spaces at 7 o'clock in the morning versus 7 o'clock at night. It says you have to provide 10 spaces. What happens is when you have something like that, the spaces aren't used as efficiently. Where you have shared use, which allows a business to use the parking when you have publicly provided parking, to use those spaces early in the day for office, retail, those kinds of things. As those uses decline in the evening, a different use that peaks later in the afternoon or in the evening can use those same spaces. So you have, for example, the theater. They are used and taking advantage of the commuter spaces as they peak in the evening hours that are being used during the day by the commuters. So that's a good example of shared use. And what we found is a shared use can actually reduce your parking requirement by about 36%. Now, as I mentioned, this is something that we did not present last time, was a determination of the parking demand. And the different colored bands reflect the different types of land use that we identified through the downtown, such as retail, the restaurant use, the movie theaters, medical office, those kinds of things. And you can see we have a peak that coincides with about the 12 to 1 p.m. time period. Now that dotted line at the top there, that reflects the adjusted observed occupancy. We've taken out the commuter demand because that's not reflected in the spaces per use, but it is reflecting what the observed occupancy is if we consider 100% of the downtown parking supply. When we look at the various parking needs and the number of spaces that they generate, you can see how it correlates to what we observed. And you see how some different uses are changing later, they're increasing later in the day, whereas they may be lower during the early part of the day. to make what we are actually observed to match what we have in terms of what the observed parking needs are. Now we take that same kind of information, that parking needs that we required at the 12 to 1 p.m. time period. Each of the various land uses has a requirement. What we then do is we apply that parking generation rate, which is, for example, 2 spaces per thousand, 3 spaces per thousand, whatever that is, by type of land use. Whatever that calculated land use, mix on the various blocks and calculate what the parking demand is per block. And what this map shows you is the blocks that are in green or blue, the total parking demand exceeds the total parking supply on that block. Now it's an aggregate number. The blocks that are in yellow show that the total calculated parking demand on that block is insufficient, or the parking supply is insufficient to support the total calculated demand on that block. And this reflects during the daytime hours. What we also did is we looked at the parking needs during the evening hours, and you see we have a block that is a significant deficit, and that coincides with basically we have the theater. They have the, let me back up for a second. The parking supply during the evening reflects the use of the commuter spaces. During the daytime, I didn't have the use of those spaces. Technically, they're available after 12 o'clock. Effectively, they're not. They're all occupied by commuters until very late in the afternoon. So we took those out of the available supply. So what we were showing here is we have one block that is significantly short, and then we have some other blocks that are they are still in a deficit condition even in the evening hours. Now, one of the deficiencies of looking at the demand in this way is we looked at a little bit different here. You see we have the demand and it says gross, and that is reflecting, again, total parking supply compared to total parking demand. And we show this in the top level of chart, show that during the daytime and lower during the evening. Overall, we have 1,081 space surplus. We have a demand of 1,680 spaces, a supply, excluding the commuter spaces, of 2,761, so we have 1,081 surplus spaces. On the north side of the tracks, that is 333 spaces. It's 748 spaces on the south side of the tracks. You look at that and say, yeah, we don't have a parking problem. What we then did is, as I mentioned before, one of the things that is deficient is that assumes that surplus private capacity is available, which in effect it is not. So the second section there, the excluding the surplus private supply, what we did was is we took out those surplus private spaces. We looked at each block. What is the demand on that block? I first attribute that demand, match it to the available private supply. If I surplus those surplus spaces, we take out of the equation. They're not available unless you're going to those specific destinations. It's not available to typically the general public. Under that basis, our 1,081 surplus is now down to 368 spaces for the entire downtown. On the north side of the tracks, it's down from 333 to 96 spaces, and you see what it is on the south side of the tracks. Now again, this is comparing the net private supply against the total public demand, which is all the on-street spaces, it is the daily spaces, or the shopper spaces in the parking garage, a few of the other small lots that the village has around town. The next step that we did in the last section was we took out not only those surplus private spaces, we took out the remote public spaces. You have a number of on-street spaces that are in the residential areas north of Rogers and Warren Avenue, going up into the residential areas there. They're 4-hour spaces, they're public spaces, but in effect, nobody's really going to walk up there to use those spaces. You're not going to walk 2 blocks, 3 blocks to use those spaces. And we also took out some spaces on the south side of the tracks along Grove and Carpenter, as not really as part of the effective supply. Under that basis, we're now down to a total surplus of the downtown of 225, and you see on the north side of the tracks it's down to 11 spaces. That's during the daytime. That's the worst case condition. So this is starting to show us that you have a perception by folks that you have a parking problem. Parking is difficult in the downtown. This is actually confirming that. Yes, it is. When I'm coming here, I can't necessarily go to if I'm not going to that destination. And an example of that on the north side of the tracks would be the AT&T lot, which came up at our last meeting. We inventoried that. There's probably I'm guessing about 70 spaces in there. We probably found maybe 20 cars in that. So that's surplus capacity, but they're not saying, hey, come here and park here right now. Now, in looking at future supply, the next thing we did was we looked at what that net available parking supply is. And again, I'm looking at, after I exclude the surplus private supply from the equation, and the available spaces reflects 85% of that parking supply. Again, with that magic threshold beyond the perception. So we're down to 313, which reflects 85% of what I had available after I threw out all the surplus private spaces. What we looked at here was, within that 313 spaces, what can I develop in new building in the downtown? And what this shows is, based on our parking generation factors, we can develop about 130,000 square feet of retail space, or 69,500 square feet of dining space, or 1,900 theater seats, or the various uses that you have as you have there. When we exclude those remote on-street spaces again, we're down to 191 total spaces available, and the amount of square footage that we can develop is reduced significantly. And on the north side of the tracks particularly, you see that most of these various uses that we can develop are in the 3,000, maybe 4,000 square foot areas. And at the bottom, we already have 11,000 square feet of vacant space. There's buildings there. They're just not occupied at this point. If those buildings were to be occupied, they're certainly going to eat up the 9 spaces that I have available. So what this is showing us is, if we want to do anything with additional development, it's going to have to come with additional parking. Conclusions that we found of this: the public supply 85% occupied. Again, that's that magic threshold. The private supply was only about 55% of those spaces occupied at peak. Commuter parking right now is stressed, as indicated by the village is not selling permits to downtown parking areas right now. And as I showed you on the slide before, excluding those surplus private spaces and the remote public spaces, north of tracks we're achieving 97% utilization, and the south of tracks 85%. So we're at or above those thresholds where people are going to perceive parking as difficult. Now, a best practice is a municipality really needs to control at least 50% of the available parking, and that goes into that shared use. But you controlling those spaces, it makes someone being able to park once, visit multiple destinations without the fear of having to move their vehicle. The village controlling that has an impact on allocation, pricing, availability, and use, and really makes you be able to use the parking most efficiently. In Downers Grove, again, after we exclude the commuter spaces during the daytime hours, you control only 45% of the parking, and that's the combination of on-street and off-street spaces. So you're below that threshold. Now, one of the things that, a lot of times when you have a deficiency of parking, first thing is, well, immediately let's look to build more parking. What we are thinking here is, can we use what we have more efficiently? And one of our recommendations is there a possibility to the village to reach out to some of these private landowners, and again I point to someone such as the AT&T building or perhaps some of the churches that may have surplus capacity during the day, and say, can we use those spaces, sell permits to put perhaps commuters in there, perhaps employees? What would work with you to use those spaces most efficiently? If the village is selling permits, they don't have to deal with the commuters individually. As part of the agreement, the village can monitor the compliance as part of their enforcement efforts. And depending on that ability, what what kind of inventory can we get. It may allow, what we would also like to see is converting some of those nice prime commuter lots to shopper parking. Push the commuters perhaps out a little bit farther in some private use, bring that private as part of the inventory, and make those nice, clearly identifiable lots along the tracks for short-term customer visitor parking. One of the things that came up specifically we were asked last time was to look at handicap parking. And ADA requirements determine the number of spaces depending on the quantity of the size of the parking area. So we looked at what is required versus what is provided, and what we were finding is you were in aggregate 10 spaces short. And you see what it is for each of these various parking areas. So obviously a recommendation there is to add additional handicap parking spaces. Now, parking enforcement, a best practice, it really, for it to function effectively, it's got to be considered as effective, it's got to be considered, it's got to be fair. The fines really, I mean, we've worked in some communities, it's really not to generate revenue, it's really to change behavior, to get folks to abide by the rules so that the parking works effectively. One of the things that we found is that is a best practice is a first time free. With the use of handheld units, they can put in a license plate number and it'll tell them this vehicle has not received a citation in the last X number of days. It can store the information. If that's the case, the enforcement officer has the ability to issue what we call a courtesy ticket, which essentially, thank you for visiting downtown Downers Grove. If you're going to stay for longer periods of time, please use the parking garage or these other locations. Limit things. We don't want to alienate someone who innocently overstayed the limit. They were here, they were down, they were shopping, they were enjoying the restaurants. But by the same token, we don't want people staying in a 2-hour spot for 4 hours. We want to encourage them where they should be parking. The handheld units, because they can track the information, they can track habitual offenders and the shuffling. Someone moving their car from one space several spaces up. It will still show, hey, this car was still on this block base, but it was 4 spaces back. And in parking enforcement, again, where we are directing folks to park really has to be clear. We don't want to be giving folks simply because our signage and our indications or any materials that we're shipping are not clearly indicating where they should be parking. One of the other recommendations for enforcement, random hours and days. We don't want to have folks knowing when the enforcement officers are going to be around. Vary that a little bit. The ability to hand out courtesy tickets, and really the village should consider enacting an anti-shuffling ordinance where someone cannot park on that same block base. And we have an example of that we can show you. The train station, again, this is another issue that came up at our last presentation. Folks who will sometimes pull into Lot B, even though it is signed as no drop-off. Someone will go in there, sit in there with their friend, significant other, waiting for the train, and someone who has a permit for that lot can't park because now the lot's full. The use of bike racks around the terminals. We did see a lot of bicycles. We were obviously doing our study during the warmer months. And one of the other things that is critical to the use of parking is folks must feel safe both for their person and for their vehicle where they are parking their vehicle. And one of the things that we noticed was, and I'm picking on Lot D, the lighting in that, because one of my colleagues during the turnover study was going in there. We were doing our surveys until 11 o'clock at night, was going there at 9 and 10 o'clock when it was dark, and felt very apprehensive driving through that lot, going to the far end where it was pitch black. And so we can see that as we get into the winter months, those lots become dark, they become unattractive for where folks want to park, and when they don't, they will park illegally. And some of the other things we noticed, and this will be in our final report, is we did an assessment of the parking areas, and there are some areas where the vegetation seemed to be a little high or a little overgrown, which presents a hiding area and presents a security issue. Best management, best practice for transportation terminals, a kitchen ride, an area to drop off folks outside those permit areas, look at where those are appropriate. Bike lockers, we've suggested that that may be a possibility. It's for someone who has maybe perhaps a more expensive bike to get it out of the weather, a little more secure to have something like that, and addressing the real and perceived security concerns of pedestrians and transit users. Again, they have to feel safe if they're going to park there, otherwise they're going to park illegally. Specific recommendation is there's the spaces just outside Lot B, which is on the south side of the train station along Burlington Avenue there. Make that, there's some on-street spaces, perhaps sign those as short-term kiss and ride spaces until perhaps 8 o'clock in the morning, so that folks can pull in, drop someone off, and then leave, and then they're still available for the longer-term parking later in the day, for the 2-hour parking for customer visitors. The lighting of the vegetation in the commuter lots, to review that. And what we're also recommending is the village consider a periodic assessment of the various parking areas, looking at the parking surface. Is it potholes? Is it cracking? Is it spalling? Is the striping adequate? Is the lighting? So that appropriate budgeting can be made so that those things can be addressed in a timely manner. Signage was a big issue, and we looked at that. We had some findings at the last survey. Now we know that the village is in the process of looking at the signage right now, but signage can improve the effective parking supply by anywhere from 5 to 15%. And there are 5 main types of sign. There's an introduction sign that someone coming into the downtown parking ahead, or public parking ahead. There's directional signs to navigate you to those public areas. There's location identification signs to tell you this is an area for you to park and what is the name of this parking area. So if you're walking around town, you can find your way back, you know where you park, but you also know that it's okay for me to park there. Now again, we're not recommending that the village start from scratch. We know you're already considering a signage program. Our recommendation here is in that program to consider those types of signs, the introduction, direction, identification signs. They really have to be clear and concise in providing information. Someone driving to be able to navigate to where they have to be and convey that information. The directional signs, one of the things that we did find at our last analysis, or our last presentation, is if I'm going to direct you from town and I tell you parking ahead, if I get to a decision point on a corner, that there's a sign there to tell me turn right, turn left, proceed straight ahead. If I get to another area where I have to make a decision, the sign is there to tell me where do I get, what do I have to do, and to provide those far enough in advance so that if I have to get in a proper lane or something, I can do that safely and efficiently. So that's just what it has to do. And then lastly, the pedestrian navigation signs. One of the things that came out of the last presentation again was you had some one-way streets. Someone coming into the village trying to find their way to a particular destination. They may find it, pass it, get down a one-way street and get all turned around and finally find a parking area. So these wayfinding signs, wayfinding kiosks to navigate you from your parking area to key destinations throughout the downtown, and perhaps even businesses can advertise on those to be able to find their way back to those from their parking area. And just some examples of the various types of parking signs. This doesn't mean this has to be what they look like. It just means that they should be consistent in terms of the parking, in terms of someone's looking for a particular type of sign. Marketing parking in the community. You see there's various brochures and examples. You're already doing a good job with it. There's information on the website that conveys where your parking areas are, what to do if you're a commuter, if you're parking downtown, if you're going to one of the other alternative stations. So there's already the basis for a lot of this information. Marketing, though, it really should be a customer and business friendly practice, meaning it's information that can be put in the businesses, pamphlets for folks to pick up. It can be co-distributed with other information, and it's really designed to be an educational of what's going on in downtown, advise individuals and businesses of what's happening in the downtown. One of the comments that we heard from our last presentation was for some of the larger events, the village starts putting out information that there's going to be no parking on the street, and one of the business owners commented to me that's basically saying don't even think of coming down here to park. I mean, we really ought to be more positive in terms of, yes, we're going to have this big event. You know, that doesn't mean, you know, a week before stop coming. We certainly want you to come. But if there's challenges because we're setting up or whatever, here's what you should be doing, and provide that information out. Encourage, and again, it's an ongoing process, and encourage businesses to provide links to the village parking website on their websites. If someone's coming down, you know, what can I, if I'm coming here, where do I park? What information is there available that can link to the village? Another best practice of what it should be doing is myths and false perceptions. People complain about there's not enough, it's too difficult, it's not safe, enforcement is too aggressive. We need to dispel those myths and make folks comfortable. And we can do that through the maps and brochures distributed, information that can be conveyed through the DMC, through their members. If the enforcement is finding that we're getting a increased abuse of the 2-hour spaces, and information can get out to the business owners, and perhaps that is employees doing that, and they need to get the word to their staff, you shouldn't be parking on the street. You know, those spaces have to be for the customers, which are why we are in business. Any changes to parking. And the last thing is clear indication of permit versus free. And I made the point on this map that you see on the slide. It shows shopper employee parking, but it shows a number of those areas green. Those are commuter lots, and especially during the day, they're really not available. So we really have to be clear with where our parking is. I'm telling someone to go there, and I go there, and there's a sign right now. If it's before 12 o'clock, I can't park in that lot. So you know, we really have to be clear in what we are conveying to folks. Just some examples of valet spaces. One of the things there was some confusion, and this just shows an example of the valet spaces outlined in green striping, and then also some possibility of some changes to perhaps some loading zone spaces. Now I know you have some areas that are striped out for loading zones right now, but there are some other areas where we saw vehicles would be blocking roadways because the trucks are trying to unload, and perhaps there's an opportunity that some spaces could be striped out for loading zone, perhaps until, you know, from 7 to maybe 11 a.m., and then those spaces are opened up during the peak afternoon, and then again during the evening. User fees is a best practice. It's really one way it's the simplest method to control your parking with paying for the spaces. It really puts it where the person benefiting from the parking is paying for it. You can allocate parking much easier through pricing. I mean, we can make the spaces that are more convenient more expensive than spaces that are less convenient. Combine that with a validation program. By putting a charge for parking, it puts the choices: do I want to pay for parking, or do I want to sort of look out transportation alternatives? And the payment is matched to the cost of parking. Now that can be both the permit rates that you're charging right now to allocate parking, to determine, you know, folks determine where they want to park. Now, one of the other things that we did is we looked at for the commuters what is being charged in some of the other communities, and here I was trying to look along the same BNS line. And for resident parking, you're charging anywhere from $75 to $90. And for non-residents from $105 to $120, and you see how you compare to some of these other communities. Naperville, for their resident, is already $110 to $120, and that varies depending on the proximity of the various parking areas. So you see that you're actually, compared to some of these communities, you're in some you're a little low, and some you're right in there with the rest of them. One of the recommendations that came out of this is permit rates, adjust them based on convenience. Right now, someone who has a permit for the top level of the parking garage is paying more to park there than they are at Lot B, which is right adjacent to the train station. Now I can see paying a premium in the parking garage if it was undercover, but I'm actually farther away and I'm paying more for parking in that. So what we're thinking is parking should be, the rates should be adjusted based on the convenience and the proximity. Implement a program of gradual rate increases for parking to fund parking improvements. And their thinking is on a several-year cycle, the rates adjust periodically so that you have the money to keep up with the rising cost of providing the parking, that the funds are there. And lastly, right now, you allow on weekends free parking in the top level of the garage for overnight parking. And our feeling there is that really that has the potential of you turning into a dumping ground. If someone is taking the train and going into downtown Chicago and staying at some of the nicer hotels, if they had to park their car there, they could be paying upwards of $50 a night. At some of the airports, the parking there is $30 a day. You charge nothing. You could generate some revenue and discourage some of that of you becoming a dumping ground for parking by charging for the spaces which are currently free on the top level of the garage. You have the capacity on the weekends to generate some revenue from it. Other recommendations, valet spaces, as we indicated, they could be a little bit better marked. There was some confusion on folks for that. The commuter spaces, capacity that we have there, right now it could be opened up prior to 12 noon, as I indicated. Most commuters are in much earlier than that, and by 8 o'clock, so by 8:30, 9 o'clock, you could probably open those spaces up. The time limits for the on-street spaces appeared appropriate. Folks were comfortable with that and being able to get their business concluded in the 2, 3, or 4-hour spaces that you have available. Implement the program of reviewing the condition of the parking areas so you can establish priority for those that do need resurfacing. And I'll pick on lot F along the train tracks. There is a lot in poor condition. I think there was Forest Lot North, there was also some potholes I noticed in that. Consider loading zones, as I indicated before. The restriction on the top level of the garage, one of the things that came up is converting the top level of the garage to entirely daily fee parking. You're already filling levels 3 and 4 of the garage with commuters. If we were to open that up, that could be filled by commuters as well. And our feeling here is right now you have employee permit parking on the second level. There are some businesses that, because their employees are only part-time, they don't want to pay the permit for those folks to park. So what we want to do is we want to have a location for those employees who will only part-time where they can go and park on the top level of the garage by not allowing that to be taken over by commuters. They have an alternative place to go where they can park their vehicles. We also indicated there's a need for some short-term, perhaps 15-minute spaces on various blocks. You have a number of businesses, dry cleaners, bakeries, pizza restaurants that people want to run in and pick up their order. Consider adding on appropriate blocks 1 or 2 short-term 15-minute spaces, and we normally recommend that those be at the end of the blocks and clearly indicated that they're 15-minute spaces. And one of the other things that came up is creating short-term spaces in the library. Right now, that entire lot is 3-hour parking. Folks want to go into the library even for half an hour. They are competing with folks who could be parked there for several hours. So we are recommending that perhaps converting some of the spaces maybe in the center row there from 30 to 90 minutes for library parking. So essentially, the summary of the recommendations that we have from this analysis is trying to shift the commuter parking, perhaps utilize some of the private property around town to use that more efficiently, perhaps move those commuter spaces and replace, allow short-term shopper parking in those spaces, the addition of the handicap spaces, enforcement, things that we might have to do there is random hours. And one of the questions that we would have for the commission is, would Saturday be appropriate? It seemed from the surveys that we did, or from the study that we did, it did seem that the employees were abusing the spaces on Saturdays instead of leaving those spaces for customer visitor, because they know that there was no enforcement on those days. Enforcement to make sure that we get the late afternoon period. Your enforcement hours are actually extended right now until 6 p.m. But folks, someone may show up at 2, 3 o'clock and know that chances are there's not going to be any enforcement that's going to get me. Along with that, enact the anti-shuffling ordinance. Prevent someone being able to park their car. And I saw this when I was in town someone get in, come out of an office, get into their car, and move it into another 2-hour space just up the street. I mean, it's really not within the spirit of what a 2-hour parking is. It's park a car, allow that space to turn over. So we think there should be an anti-shuffling ordinance. The time limits, as we said, those seem to be appropriate, although consider some short-term in the forest lot. Signage has to be improved. Charge for the overnight parking, valet signage. One of the things, and I think this may already be part of the ordinance, is a valet vehicle, where a valet operator who wants to provide that, where are they going to park those vehicles? And I saw this in another community. They were parking in a prime customer visitor lot that was 10 feet from the valet station. And our recommendation there was, fine, if you're going to park that, but make them the less convenient spaces. And in this other instance, it was going up to the top of the hill to another portion of a public lot. It was a little more remote rather than take, valet taking his car and moving the car 10 feet. Charge for more convenient parking. Again, those spaces that are most convenient should probably have a higher charge than spaces that are more remote parking. The need for some short-term parking, and increasing the permit fees on a regular basis. The non-permit holder parking, restrict that to 9:30. Additional, as we showed from the demand calculations, we're probably going to have to add some additional parking on the north side of the tracks, and consider that we're going to have to start building the funds up in order to provide that. Looking at the parking lot conditions, and then the marketing program to educate and inform folks about the parking. So with that, that basically concludes our presentation. And what's next is we would just like to get some input and some feedback on your thoughts on some of these.